All right, we are live here with another episode of the Meat Mafia podcast. We're joined by Tristan Scott, author of Bitcoin and Beef, two topics that we love. So we're pumped to have him here. Let's go, Tristan. We're ready to talk a little Bitcoin and beef?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys. It's really a pleasure to be on your podcast. It's crazy to me that I've found so many like-minded people, especially just diving into your following on Twitter has been a new realm of how many Bitcoiners and people that are into, the regenerative ag, carnivore movements and the overlap there. And that's kind of, how I got into this, why I wrote this book. So yeah, it's really exciting. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, we're excited to host you, man. And I've got the book right here. The book is absolutely fantastic, by the way. We like a lot of great connections on the podcast. We connected on Twitter through DMs, and you were gracious enough to send both Clemenza and I a copy of it. I think I read it in like a week and a half, cover to cover. Like it flowed so perfectly. Like you do such a great job of breaking down these seemingly very complex topics around our currency and our food system. And a lot of what we get asked about is, why is there such a strong convergence between Bitcoin and beef? So now we have like the perfect book to just point them in the right direction to. So thank you for that. But I think, Tristan, a great starting point for this conversation, we would love to just learn a little bit more about really what inspired you to go through and write a book on the convergence of these two topics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just kind of give my background in general. I really first, I guess, kind of got into the health space. I was a college athlete. I played soccer in college, had one too many concussions. And towards the end of my college years as an engineering student, was in a really bad place mentally from one that put me over the edge. I had kind of post-concussive syndrome, it's called, for over a year, like daily headaches. Went from, being a soccer player, exercising, working out every day, 20, 30 hours a week, to pretty much not being able to walk across campus without being, extremely fatigued, sleeping like 10, 12 hours a night, just to be able to look at my computer for, enough hours to pass classes. So that's what, and then I went to, the neurologist and got kind of the classic response in terms of, concussion recovery, to take it easy and slowly work your way back into it. There's not much we can do, invisible injury, common story here. And that kind of put me down the rabbit hole. I started, reading some books, listening to some podcasts, kind of started with like Ben Greenfield and then went from there. And I'm sure you guys know, once you go down the rabbit hole, you kind of start experimenting left and right, supplements, diet changes, lifestyle changes. So that was like 3+ years ago. That's how I got into health, and pretty much just been obsessed ever since, because I completely changed my life. I feel better now than I did before my concussion, which is outstanding considering how poor of a mental state I was in. And then recently have, gotten more on, the animal-based diet train. I think it makes more sense, ancestrally consistent, especially for me, kind of Central Northern European descent. I spend most of my time in Wyoming and Utah, so probably not as much produce and vegetables and fruit for the majority of the year compared to other areas of the world. And then, I've spent a lot of time getting into farming and regenerative agriculture as well recently, the past couple of years. So that's something that that's where my interest has landed. So it's really turned my life around. And I, started Instagram a couple of years back to kind of first focus on talking about my recovery from concussion and mild TBIs. I had a podcast for a little bit as well with that, but then I wanted to expand it to kind of just the sharing knowledge around the greater, health space. So that's kind of the background there. And I really enjoyed, and this is kind of the theme of how I was able to take back control of my life when I really was so limited. To be honest. And it was really a bad place. And I feel like a lot of people struggle with this, maybe not from a direct injury, but just from the standard American diet taking its course over time, right? So that's kind of the background on my journey in the health space. And in terms of Bitcoin and decentralized finance, alternative finance overall, that was more so kind of a generic path, you know, engineering student at a tech school, kind of got interested in crypto early 2017, and, you know, rode the hype of the bull market in 2017. And it was just this euphoria, and, you know, it's a new technology. You feel like you're part of like the dot-com bubble in the late 90s, early 2000s. So that was awesome. And then, yeah, kind of from there was obsessed with learning about that. Got stuck down, you know, a few terrible altcoin projects, and we know how that might go. And the whole bear market of, you know, 2018, 2019 really just, you know, spent a lot of time learning. And about a year and a half ago, it really clicked in my mind to come back to just Bitcoin, and why is Bitcoin so fundamentally better than every other cryptocurrency. So spent a lot more time the past year or so kind of digging into that, and, you know, what it comes down to. And as I started meeting more people on Instagram, did an animal-based retreat in Costa Rica, and just talked to more people like you every day. And why are so many Bitcoiners carnivores and, you know, into farming and, you know, this lifestyle of homesteading, living off the grid, and why are so many health focused people into Bitcoin? And for me, why I wrote this book is because I saw such a convergence between those two communities, because they really stand by the foundational principle of to take back control of two items of their life that are so heavily important, from which has been robbed by, you know, the greater system that's going on here in the US and in the world, right? So the food, the health, and then the financial system. So our health and our wealth, I mean, money and health is so important for your everyday life. And taking back control of those things is really putting you in the driver's seat to live a fantastic life. So that's why I wrote this book, because there's so many similarities in the criticisms, in, you know, the media painting a picture of demonizing beef specifically, and then Bitcoin specifically, whether it be environmental impact, energy consumption, and then the amount of corruption that's going on from, you know, political lobbying, the fines that these companies pay, the subsidies for monocrop agriculture, the media advertising, you could go on and on. So yeah, that's kind of the foundation why I wrote this book. I think it really converges nicely, and is why so many guys like you are into this. It's all about taking back control of our lives.
Yeah, the control and ownership go hand in hand. And I think when you talk about taking ownership of your health and taking ownership of, you know, your finances through an asset like Bitcoin, you're talking about an asset that, you know, what some people will say, it's unfuckable with money. That's, if you own it, you own it. Like someone can't take it from you. And so I think that there's a lot of overlap there, right? Like clearly that's what you've written the book about. And I'm curious, when it came to writing the book, what came first? Was it Bitcoin, or were you more so focused on, you know, writing them hand in hand?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, I first was going to call this book Bitcoin and biohacking, but then I realized that I absolutely hate that word, and I hate the connotation that it has, because it was really about health and, you know, finance, and that's where I see the biggest convergence. But you can't really, it doesn't click as well. So I definitely got rid of biohacking, and the conception of biohacking is, you know, you spend money on these fancy gadgets to kind of, yeah, shortcut the way to health, but that's totally the, you know, the opposite of what I'm about. So it came back to beef, because that's the center of, you know, my diet. I think it should be the center of a lot of people's diets. And I realized, yeah, the environmental impact, the misconceptions about farming, you know, it is such a tool to bring back life into our food system. So that's where it kind of pivoted. That's what the title of the book is called, but in reality, it's more than just beef. It's about the food system and the health system and the financial system, not just, you know, beef. So that was kind of, and to answer your question, where did I start? kind of wanted, I took it chapter by chapter. I didn't really jump around because how the book is laid out is there's kind of an introductory chapter to each one. So chapter 1 is what is Bitcoin, because that is something that I even added way more information to towards the end of the editing process, because I feel like the average person has heard of Bitcoin. They probably know that it's blockchain and that it has an anonymous founder, but they really have no idea how it functions as a network. And if you don't know how it functions, you don't know how Bitcoin is mined, you don't know the fundamentals, you can't criticize it because it's a highly technical, piece of innovation. So that's why there's so many of these ridiculous statements made by the mainstream media, because technically they have no idea how it works. So that was kind of setting the scene for Bitcoin and the background, why scarcity is important, things like that, why, third world countries can benefit greatly from this. And then setting the scene for the food system, talking a lot about chronic disease, seed oil is your favorite topic, of course, things like this, and how the demonization of saturated fats has not helped whatsoever. And that kind of gives people a background. And then I dove into the big main criticisms of each. Chapter 3, Bitcoin, chapter 4, beef. Those are that's like the meat, I would say, of the book. And then from chapters 5 through 8, I kind of converge the path of decentralization and the bigger picture, like subsidies, marketing, lobbying, and how that's related. So that's kind of how the book's laid out. I did go chapter by chapter and of course came back and added to it, but it's really setting the scene in 2 separate systems and then converging on, what is the solution? And for me, that's a more decentralized structure of both of them.
Yeah, you do such a good job in the beginning of the book with these two, with part 1, laying the table for these just very foundational topics that set the theme for the rest of the book. And, chronic disease is something that we spend a lot of time talking about on our podcast and on our Twitter. And a lot of people don't know that in 1900, almost all of our diseases were infectious diseases. Cause of death were caused by infectious diseases. And I think now it's like 7 out of every 10 deaths is caused by chronic disease, right?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers just are staggering for
It's
sure.
staggering. It's staggering. So my question to you, right? Because obviously you're going into this book already very, very well versed in the food system, proper understanding of nutrition, sound money, et cetera. When it relates to food and beef in particular, and just the food system, were you surprised? Was there more corruption than you were initially anticipating when you were peeling back the curtain, or was it as expected?
Yeah, I mean, I would say for sure. I think it was way worse than I thought it was, and I stumbled upon bits of information that it's just crazy. I think it's been shown a few times, but how the top 4 meat packers, JBS, Tyson, and a couple other companies are controlling 80% of the beef in the United States, and globally it's a similar number. How much is spent on subsidies? It's absolutely crazy, and lobbying, things like that. So those are the types of statistics I would say that really were eye-opening, like I knew about, but I have it put up here. Since 1995, the US has spent 115 billion in corn subsidies, and if you add in wheat and soybeans, it's over $200 billion. So that's over half of the subsidies issued for the crops. It's just incredible how broken the system is. But then you're like, why is this still happening? And then you go and you research about the lobbying numbers, and this is all like public information. And there's this cool website called Open Secrets that'll just tell you how much like all these companies have lobbied and to which political party. And you just go in and see like Bayer and Monsanto, they're spending like $5, $6, $8, $10 million each year just to cover up all the stuff with Roundup, and PepsiCo, Nestle are spending multi-million dollars each year. And then if you want to get into the real big numbers, you go look at the commercial banks and how much they're handing out to federal candidates or parties. It's just insane the amount of, you know, filling people's pockets to kind of sway legislation in your direction is really eye-opening. And I think there's some really great books out there. Food Fix by Mark Hyman kind of got me interested in looking more into the, you know, the political side of why this is all going on, how did we get here kind of path. And that made me want to track down some of this information and put it in the book. So I would say that was kind of these types of statistics, and maybe also just the size of the average farm, or you know, how many farms there were 100 years ago versus today, which has showed an extreme consolidation and centralization, were the biggest eye openers personally.
Clemenza, maybe we should unpack the corn subsidies, because I know that that's something that you're passionate about. You've spent a lot of time talking about that on the podcast and just some of our private conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the stuff that I find concerning too, like with the subsidies, is, you know, these three crops that you mentioned, wheat, corn, and soy, are so hyper subsidized, and like 60% of those, the produce or yield of all of those crops ends up going into the beef industry, like the bad ends of the beef industry, to feed cattle in these feedlots. And you're talking about a food system that is growing worse and worse through these misaligned incentives. You know, I see a lot of the same things that you're seeing, Tristan, where centralization is really the core cancer in the system, where when you start to have centralization and you start to have people who are in power without proper natural laws governing their incentive decisions, they start to make choices that don't actually have any consequences tied to them. And so they're not doing things out of survival. They're doing them because they know that there is a floor on what can happen. So it's like this broken incentive system ultimately leads into the terrible food system, our health. And then now we're sitting here with, you know, what is it, 88% of people with some sort of metabolic dysfunction, and a lot of that is food related. So when you do start to see these intricate ties in what the problems are, it's really, I mean, I think your book is really hitting on an issue here around centralization. I'm curious if you see it the same way, where centralization of power just plays this role in both of these industries, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's interesting to think about is how this all got started. And it was really from a, you know, World War perspective, feed the nation, you know, industrialize, because it's the most efficient from a yield perspective. And the US was so great at that. You know, we were just cranking out food, and the subsidies kind of helped make that happen, right? But it really should have been a temporary measure. And then, you know, the World War II was won, and, you know, there was such a population boom, hysteria as well. But we know today, none of that's, you know, we have plenty of food. We have way too much food of the wrong kind. So these subsidies kind of just stayed over time, and these large corporations kind of just were like, okay, if, you know, if this ingredient is way cheaper. I mean, in the 70s, all the soft drink companies just switched over from sugar to high fructose corn syrup because it was a fraction of the price. So whose fault is it really? You know, the corporations are taking advantage of a clear, you know, loophole, if you want to call it, or just obvious advantage in the marketplace. And then that's just grown their top line revenue over time, which, to your point, has increased the centralization of these companies at the top. And now they just have so much more power and influence in legislation, and that's where it comes back to all the, you know, lobbying and being directly influencing our politicians. So it's kind of been a negative feedback loop, and we never went back to what we were. And it's really how do we change that from here when it's so ingrained in the system?
And do you have an answer to that? Do you think that the answer lies in your title, Bitcoin and Beef?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about. And if you want to really get back into the weeds of why were we even, in world wars so often in the 1900s. I know Seyfedin has tied it to Britain going off the gold standard, entering World War I and in the early 1900s. So in reality, everything is connected. So it's so interesting to geek out on that. But how do we fix it? I mean, even though we have so much government intervention with subsidies and things like that, the consumer really has a lot of power in the United States food system. Unfortunately, we're really facing an uphill battle. And what I write about as a result of these subsidies, and what you guys know, you go to the store, canola oil, soybean oil. I mean, this stuff is pennies on the dollar compared to anything that is remotely good for you. Beef and other meats are expensive compared to really cheap processed foods. So that's the uphill battle. However, I think we've been making a lot of progress the past couple of years, and I would say the trend is health. The trend is transparency. The internet has done a great job of that. So that needs to continue. We need to taper off the subsidies. I think that's an obvious way to show what does the free market say, because that's the whole issue, right? With increased centralization. It goes back to our government. Why is our government meddling so much in all these things? And if you ask a generic corn farmer, they're just doing it for the guaranteed paycheck, because even if their crops get blown out, even if they don't have a single head of corn, they will get paid by the government because of these subsidies, because of crop insurance protection. If they just hop off to the regenerative train, it's a risk. But there's been more effort, Joel Salatin, Gabe Brown are starting these movements and have been and educating farmers to make the switch over. So it's twofold. It's on the production farming side that more and more need to switch over and disband their relationship with the government. The government needs to taper those subsidies, which I feel like is the least likely thing to happen. And then we need more momentum on the consumer side of things. So there is no reset button. It's not going to happen. It's slow progression on all fronts, and then slowly we'll see a better change. But the good thing about technology is there's way more transparency now. People are asking way more questions. I mean, you can just get a quality egg sourced, and they'll have videos on their website, live cams of their chickens. Like, that's something that would have never happened like 30 years ago, and people would have never questioned it. That's just an example. So yeah, I think it's all hands on deck to move this in the right direction, I would say.
Yeah, I feel like all three of us think pretty similarly, where we're trying to not overcomplicate things and try and give simple solutions that are incredibly effective, right? And the best place to start for now is to gravitate towards a hyper localized approach to eating. And it's like, I feel like we're almost beating this message to death, but it's like, find a local rancher or farm close to you that you can connect with and intentionally source your food from. And a lot of people might not necessarily know who that rancher is, but I can pretty much guarantee that if you live in the US, there's some type of farmer's market within 15 minutes, 20 minutes max, that will aggregate all the local vendors, ranchers, farmers, small businesses, et cetera, that you can build relationships with. And that's an amazing starting point. Like, that's literally what I did when I moved to San Diego and I didn't know any farms. You go to the local farmers market a couple miles down the road, and you start to build these personal relationships with ranchers. You have a relationship with them, and they're actually incentivized to provide you with the best quality food and protein possible. They know you, they know your family's name, they'll hook you up with discounts. It's just a very different experience compared to this disconnectedness of, just picking up this meat in some type of a plastic wrap package. You can't even really verify whether the meat is grass-fed, grass-finished, et cetera. Meanwhile, if the three of us have a relationship with a rancher, they can tell you exactly how the cows were raised. Did they use any antibiotics? Did they finish it on corn? Was it grass-finished? It's just a very different level of autonomy with the food that you're actually choosing to put into your system. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the whole point of this book as well, is I tried to not get like too technical and keep it somewhat high level, because it's really written for, the person who maybe has a general knowledge of these topics, but wants to dive deeper. But obviously, I'm not an expert in Bitcoin. I'm not an expert in regenerative farming. I don't own a regenerative farm. I'm not, working for a blockchain company or a core developer of the Bitcoin network. So I have a firm understanding. I've researched a lot on these topics, and I've kind of just tried to put it all in one place for people to take away what's really important. And what you just said is my recommendation a lot at the end of the book is, shop local, both from, personal food security standpoint. That's become a big issue recently with the global supply chain crisis. So I think that just has accelerated this trend maybe even a little bit further, which is fantastic. As a lot of these crops are traded and import export across the world globally. Ukraine-Russia conflict has put that on high alert in a lot of places as well. So going to your local farmers market and just getting an understanding of what grows locally, what they're doing. These farmers and ranchers are so excited to talk to anyone, especially if they're younger, because we have such an aging farming population. It's really a big problem. I think the average age of a farmer is like in the 60s, and the next generation doesn't want to take that back on because it's really not a lucrative business. Because it was just guaranteed income from the subsidies. They're really not making a lot of money outside of just keeping their operations going, paying their mortgage. But now with all this, direct to consumer, direct online marketing, a lot of these, regenerative farm beef companies, they're making a killing, I'm sure, because they're charging more for quality, but they're cutting out the 4 steps that a typical rancher might go through, wholesaler, distributor, packer, grocery store to get to your plate. They're really, in a traditional process, might be getting 20-30% of that dollar you pay, while as direct to consumer, they're probably getting 70-80%. So that's a benefit for everyone involved, and it reduces the complexity of the supply chain and ensures transparency as well. So that's a great place to start, and definitely what I recommend in the book as easy takeaways on how you can improve the food system.
Tristan, what are some of the core myths around both these topics that maybe have some similar overlaps?
So I mean, that's the meat of the book, like I mentioned earlier, is the criticisms of Bitcoin and beef. So the one where the biggest overlap is that you probably hear the most about in the mainstream media is the environmental impact. So for Bitcoin, it's the massive energy consumption. They're often compared to European countries. Elizabeth Warren has been on her horse about this topic, and it's absolutely hilarious. Often comparing transactional energy consumption, which means nothing, because once the Bitcoin is mined, it can be transacted 1 million times, and the energy is, it's coming from once it's mined and put in circulation, not per transaction. So that's an example. And then of course, beef. Why does everyone go vegan? Predominantly, I would say it's for the planet, right? There's, ethical reasons for sure. There's cancer diet concerns, which I think I also write about in the book, and I think are easily addressed if you look at the flawed research. And if you know anything about nutrition, which I know you both do, those are more obvious, but I think the main ones I would say is the environmental piece. At least that's my opinion. So yeah, we could get into those arguments, why I think they're totally flawed and nuanced, if you guys want.
I would love to, because I think that when an outsider who doesn't know much about Bitcoin or the beef industry starts to come into contact with these topics, they are just going to anchor their thinking in the headlines that they read. And the headlines that they read are the ones that you mentioned. It's like, oh, cows are bad for the environment because they don't even know why. Like methane. Okay. Tell me more about that. Do you actually know what you're talking about when you bring up these points? And when you push back, they don't. And the same thing happens for Bitcoin mining. It's like, when you really look at it from the perspective that I think most Bitcoiners look at it, like this is energy being used in its highest form. and best use. So I think, both of these industries are really kind of in their David versus Goliath moment. I think that they'll both prevail, but I'm really curious to dig into this topic with you because I think that it's one that will be the black eye on both of them for a while, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we get right into maybe start with beef farming and overall livestock carbon emissions. So in general, this is a really overstated topic that, if you just have a public perception, the way the media, I think, makes it out to seem is that, cows are somehow responsible for like a third of all carbon emissions. That's basically like my takeaway when I read some of these articles, or there's these blanket statements made about not eating meat to save the planet. It's the biggest, easiest difference you can make, and that's really where they market it to, because people aren't going to stop driving cars. They're probably not going to stop flying to go to vacation. They're definitely not going to like turn on their lights less or use less water. I mean, these are very hard to change in our comfortable lives. So if you just convince someone that, if you just eat something different, they can really get around that. But to be honest, they're really barely making any impact. And if anything, as and why regenerative farming has such a major, piece of this discussion is that they could be potentially really hurting the regeneration of our environment, our biodiversity, and our soil health. So let's start by setting the scene. And this is what I like to do, is what really are what is the piece of the pie that cows make up in terms of carbon emissions? So, and that's also important to know, this is all calculated in equivalent carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions. And if you do look at that at a national level, livestock and manure, at an international level, livestock and manure is around like 5-6%. These manure lagoons are a byproduct of the industrial CAFO, centralized animal feeding operation systems. They're really unnatural. And if you have pasture-raised beef or regenerative farm beef, it's totally unnecessary because the manure is actually the best part. It's fertilizing the soil. But either way, 5-6%. If you look at just cows, probably the average is, or the number is around 4 or 5%. And that's not internationally, and the EPA has similar numbers. They don't break it down as granular, but it's likely around 4 or 5%. I think the total number for all of agriculture is around 10%. So that's just setting the scene, 4 or 5%, let's say, and that's what experts like Dr. Frank Mitloehner, if you've seen him, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, on Twitter and everywhere from UC Berkeley, who's a big proponent of defending meat, says is accurate. And either way, 4 or 5%, that's really not a large piece of the pie. The transportation industry, the energy sector as a whole is really making up, the majority. So whether it's transportation, in industry, heavy industry, just electricity, lighting, residential, commercial, these are really the large piece of the pie when it comes to equivalent carbon emissions. And just to get
not to disrupt your flow too, but I think in defense of cows too, when you look at emissions, you're also not considering the nutrient density of this food quality. So if you're thinking about Bitcoin as well, you're talking about money that is the internet of money, where you can give access to a financial system to everyone around the globe who has connection to the internet. And that the upside in that is enormous. But in the same sense, like beef provides this abundant energy source for people. And it's almost not even fair to compare the emissions without taking into consideration the quality of the nutrients that the animal actually creates too.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally unfair. And yeah, the upcycling of nutrients is absolutely incredible. I mean, we talked about all the subsidies for soy and corn, and half that crop can't even be eaten. So like pigs and cows can upcycle nutrients that humans can't even eat. Obviously, we can't eat grass. So yeah, totally unfair, but let's make it even more unfair of a comparison by going into this. And a statistic that I like to show is the electricity and heat sector. This is international data, or that from a time period of 8 years, from 2005 to 2013, this was the largest emitting sector, how they break it down in equivalent carbon dioxide emissions. And it increased around 3 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions from an 8-year period, 2005 to 2013. 3 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions is the same amount total that can be attributed to animal lives. So in 8 years, one sector increased the same magnitude. That is the worst case estimation of ruminant animal livestock. That's something that's been going on for hundreds of years. So that's just setting the scene of, this, how this fits into the bigger picture, right? And the other important statement I made in the last sentence is that's been going on for hundreds of years, thousands of years. So ruminant animals have been around for the existence of humanity. And from 1900 onwards, we're mostly having, domestic cattle, livestock such as hogs, chickens, things like that. Chickens are monogastric, but still, in the pre-1800 era in the United States, we had 50 to 75 million bison, 30 million deer, antelope, elk, moose. We had, a much higher population of wild ruminants, and this is what I write about in the book. And although there is some research, and it's probably true, suggesting that wild ruminants, they have a lower rate of methane, enteric emissions, it's called. It's about maybe 50% lower than, a traditional cattle, steer that's being grazed for beef. So even worst case estimation, and I did all the summing of the wild ruminants, it's basically equivalent if you add up, all the bison, elk, to right now we have about a 94 million count cattle herd in the United States. And if you add it all up, it's roughly similar to a number that would be consistent with wild ruminant standards. So based on that, you can say that maybe over the last 300 years, when we added in all these domestic cattle to our pastures in place of the wild ruminants, we increased the equivalent carbon dioxide emissions in the form of methane, maybe 2x, worst case estimation. Every single other industry did not even exist 300 years ago. So that's an infinite increase, because this was pre-industrial revolution. There were no cars, there were no lights, there were no, before any of this was invented, there was no carbon emissions really, except from burning fire and candle and, when the steamboat entity came online. So that's another comparison that I like to make. And if you are a fan of absolute versus relative statistics, and there's a headline saying that, emissions from beef has increased 200% in the last 100 years, you'd be like, oh my God, that's like insane. But in reality, actually, the beef herd in the United States has been decreasing since the 70s. Actually, it's down like 20, 30% since the 70s. So I think it's really selfish to blame beef for any of the issues that can be attributed to climate change. So that's how I like to set the scene for emissions. But a place where I feel like I found some differentiated information is around how they categorize and how they calculate carbon emissions. So everything I just talked about, I had previously, had an understanding of. I kind of got that it was way overstated, but what I didn't really know was how they calculate carbon emissions. So like you said, and like we know, the emissions coming from animals is in the form of methane. Methane is not carbon dioxide. Everything on the EPA and the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which releases and does a lot of these calculations, is calculated in carbon dioxide, CO2 emission equivalents. So methane has, and all other gases, has a global warming potential metric. It's called GWP. And this is basically a scaling factor. Methane has a scaling GWP factor or rating of 28 to 29 for the IPCC and up to 36 for the EPA. So that means it's getting multiplied by 28 to 36 times because it's methane instead of carbon dioxide. That is insane. So why is that? The EPA states, methane emitted today lasts about, a decade on average, but it has a much higher energy absorption rate compared to carbon dioxide. What's important to remember is that it lasts about a decade, 10 to 12 years in the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide lasts from 300 to 1,000 years. So they're two totally different types of gases. The methane is a flow gas and CO2 is what's called a stock gas. So methane has 10 to 12 year lifespan in the atmosphere. CO2 has up to 1,000 years of lifespan in the atmosphere. And although methane, does absorb more energy, these scaling factors or these global warming potential metrics are completely biased against methane. Because of that really short lifespan, once you reach a steady state, you're actually not contributing any additional equivalent carbon emissions to the atmosphere. And the University of Oxford has a really great, or Oxford University, sorry, has some really great research on why this metric is totally skewed. And the professor and researchers there came up with a new system, which they called the global warming potential star, basically. And they basically say that because it only has such a short time frame in the atmosphere, it reaches that steady state much faster, and it's super inaccurate in representing long-term global temperature change. And they've run simulations and basically said that the current scaling factor global warming potential is completely inaccurate and biased towards methane. So the way you can think about it, guys, is say you have you get your little ranch started and it's going great. You got maybe 100 head of cattle, and you kind of don't add any cattle to that, amount. You keep it steady state for quite some time, you for a decade plus. You kind of don't add any additional greenhouse gas emissions after that. Although you still have the herd, if that herd stays the same size for a decade, it's really in a steady state position. However, if in accordance with a future Paris Agreement, climate agreement, that they're proposing, a carbon/green tax, you will still get taxed every year you have, say 100 cattle on your farm or your ranch. However, it's really equivalent to maybe a power station, say a coal mine that shut down 100 years ago, but emitted X amount of carbon. That's still in the atmosphere for another, few hundred years. And that is the same comparison. And that's what these Oxford researchers compare it to, is that it's really can't be compared in the same ballpark as carbon dioxide, and the current metric is totally skewed. So that was something that was really eye-opening for me, because that's basically the majority of, ranchers. And as I said earlier, our total herd in the US has decreased. So if anything, the carbon emissions due to cattle, equivalent carbon emissions, is going down, is literally going down decade on decade, because it's methane, a natural process that also has a total play in the natural carbon cycle and local climate and all that good stuff, which we could get into. But it really is, from a fundamental standpoint of science, everything is just totally skewed. So I would say that's my biggest discovery in the book, and really blew my mind. And for me, that ends the conversation of really demonizing beef. And we haven't even talked about regenerative farming or negative carbon beef yet.
Right, which is the other side of the coin, where you start talking about the positive externalities to having these animals raised in line with how they're supposed to be raised out in pastures, recycling carbon, recycling nutrients back into the soil. People just aren't even aware of that whole process. And one of the things that we've gotten to learn more about too is like the water cycle, and how the water cycle is being negatively impacted by all the chemicals that are being put into the soil, glyphosate, all these chemical fertilizers. It's killing the bacteria in the soil and the humus in the soil to actually create irrigation and allow the water to go into the soil. And what environmentalists know is that a lot of these water tables in the US are drying up. And a lot of it is for those reasons. And it's the cow's responsibility in a lot of ways to recycle these nutrients back into the ground. And then when you hear things like what Ethan Brown, the CEO of Impossible or Beyond, either one.
Pat Brown.
Yeah. Saying that we should eliminate all cows from the earth. You actually really, like, this guy's like a well-educated guy. How do you come to that conclusion? Like that blows my mind, that someone who's like gone to school, like a very like a highly regarded institution, and he can say something like that. That is, and he's raised millions of dollars, and he can stand there in full honesty and say that blows my mind.
Yeah, I mean, because that's what we're taught. We have a system that's set up for high input, high output farming, but we know that over time those yields stagnate as the soil health is destroyed, and the organic matter is destroyed as we continue to till and use high pesticides, high fertilizers. So yeah, that's the whole other end of the spectrum. Is there's no warrant in saying it's bad for the environment, but then it's actually the key to restoring the environment and biodiversity and soil health, which is the biggest carbon sink in the world. And actually, what a lot of modern companies are doing now, which I think is fascinating, is there's always this comparison that, they're cutting down the Amazon to graze beef. They're actually not. They're cutting down the Amazon, then they graze beef for like a year to fertilize, the soil, and then they grow like soybeans, because it's way more profitable. And why you say, the CEO of a fake meat company is saying these things, because it's so much more profitable. The margin on fake foods is absurd. I mean, it's way less effort, it's scalable, it's just way more lucrative from a business perspective. That's why everyone's pushing this agenda. If you work in any sort of business, you get it, but you're also destroying the planet. So yeah, I mean, we could talk about, White Oak Pastures has proven that their soil sequestration of carbon by grazing, rotationally grazing, regeneratively farming beef has resulted in a negative carbon footprint burger or slab of ground beef, which is fantastic. So, but in reality, what is the key takeaway? The key takeaway is that regenerative farming with cattle is the most effective way to increase, and with ruminants in general, I should say, I'm not being totally biased towards just cattle, sheep, goats, bison, they're all amazing, is the best way to increase organic matter in the soil. And the healthier the soil, the more carbon it can sequester, the more biodiverse the environment, the healthier everything in the ecosystem is, the more water you're able to retain. This is the key. And the Rodale Institute has done some fantastic research, and they've done a head-to-head comparison, because people always ask me, well, what if you just regeneratively farm, with just plants? And it's not the same. The Rodale Institute has shown that with and without cattle, with cattle always reigns supreme in terms of the amount of organic matter in the soil. While they both outperform conventional farming methods, regenerative with ruminants is the superior way, and it's the way nature would intend to graze and have an ecosystem naturally. You would have diverse plant species, diverse amount of small animals and rodents, and then you'd have large ruminants, you'd have birds, you'd have the millions of micro fungal matter and everything. And you talked about that already. So this is really great stuff. And why are we never taught about how important this is? And it's really just logical from, in terms of thinking about it from how would nature go about doing this. And that's what makes the most sense. So I think it's pretty obvious. I think for your audience, you've had some guests that really experience regenerative farming. So I won't go too much down that rabbit hole. But for me, the other important thing and item that I saw was always debated is regenerative agriculture scalable? Can we feed the world with regenerative agriculture? So I did a couple math thought experiments that I wrote about in the book, and I can share that here. And I think it's a complicated answer, so the way I looked at it was, could we just take our 94 million head of cattle that we're doing right now in the United States and all meat per se, chicken, hogs, turkey, sheep, goats, and raise them on pasture raised / regenerative standards? And the answer is absolutely we can. So that first thought experiment, math experiment that I did, and we definitely can. According to the USDA, there's 800 million acres in the United States that are considered grazable lands. And this is often used against our argument. There's a Bloomberg article that came out saying, 800 million acres are being used to graze cattle. This is absolutely ridiculous. If you think all 800 million of those acres are used to graze cattle, you have no idea what's going on in the food system. More than half of that is probably just sitting idle, and more than half of that is not able to be used for literally anything else. So there's also the beauty of ruminant animals is they can graze land that is not able to be used for agriculture, and actually probably isn't able to be used until after they graze it and increase the biodiversity and organic matter in the soil. So either way, and I've seen this firsthand. I've driven across the country like 5 times. I drive around Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, like a lot. And it's so obvious. I could be driving for 3 hours and not see anything. And then I'll see a small herd of cattle. So we're obviously not taking advantage of all our pasture. And the math I did was if we raise all these animals, 94 million cattle, 180 million chicken, or sorry, this is land needed. We can get there with, actually, my estimation was about half of those grazable lands if we used for pasture raised standards for all these. And I was conservative in this estimation. So 2-3 acres per calf cow pair. We have plenty of land. We just need to efficiently manage it and educate our ranchers on regenerative farming, rotational grazing techniques. And another data point is there's this large scale regenerative farming business, I think that's out of Brazil or Uruguay, called Rizoma. And they've done some really great at scale experiments showing that regenerative farming can work at scale, and how much carbon dioxide equivalent emissions would be offset if the entire global soy, corn, cattle production were farmed using their regenerative grain and pasture systems. So I would say that absolutely it's scalable, but it's probably complicated how we get there. And then you also have to remember that we're using 190 million acres to farm just corn and soybeans, and half of that is growing, or more than half of that's going to animal feed, predominantly not cattle, actually more so for chicken, poultry, and hogs. But yeah, I think there's a lot of land, and it's definitely an answer that is complex, but I think it's feasible. I don't know if you guys agree. I'm sure you do, but
well, I'm honestly think I'm going to probably go back and listen to this part of the segment of the podcast like 5 different times. Right. And Clemens, I know you're thinking the same thing because you just packed in so much good information. But I think about what we just talked about is like the perfect antidote to a lot of people that maybe I used to work with in New York City that are like just kind of like blindly supporting this plant-based agenda. And they see like a snippet on Instagram with one of the cherry pick statistics of, oh, meat consumption is up 200% year over year, or like some cherry pick statistic about how it's terrible for the environment, and then be able to direct them in your direction. So they actually understand the differences between CO2 and methane and all the different nuances that you just laid out. And the point of it is like, this stuff is complicated, but if you think that you're going to just read some like cherry pick statistic on Instagram, regardless of what side you're on, and get the big picture, you're just flat out wrong and living in fantasy land, I think you said. So I don't know, Clemens, I don't know if you think anything differently, but there's just so much good stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that trying to oversimplify some of these problems and some of these topics is like the root of all of the, honestly, ignorance is probably the right word. And it's, a lot of people are just out for the talking point and not actually out to actually understand the root cause and root solution to a lot of these topics, which I think are, if you're looking 100 years in the future and trying to build a society that doesn't have these serious chronic diseases, you need to fix the food system. You need to fix the environment in a way that is sustainable, that is redirecting the incentives in the right direction. And I don't think that people take a long enough view. We tend to work between election cycles every 4 years. And so I think that is also a key component of your book, Tristan, which is like, hey, these people are being lobbied left and right to have an opinion on this. And it's not even their opinion, it's the opinion of a corporation. So, you need to, I think Bitcoiners have done such an amazing job of coming up with these catchy ways of thinking about these really core pillars. Like zoom out is one. It's like we need to zoom out when it comes to basically every problem and take the long-term view. And that's where I think Bitcoiners really do have a unique understanding of society, of money, which is the basis of society, of the food system. There's just a lot to unpack, but I do think that like your book and everything you've talked about today really covers like some really, really in-depth and key issues that our world needs to do a better job of trying to actually address, as opposed to just put the Band-Aid on it, forget about it, and like rewrite the incentives. I mean, what are we really incentivizing here when we have crop production is really rooted in this global feed the world ideology that it doesn't really work. Like we need more localized food systems. So there's a lot there. It was kind of a long rant, but I do think that everything you're saying just hits on all these points, that both of these topics are just so misunderstood from the wider audience.
Yeah, and they're complicated.
Yeah,
Just straight up. Like these are complex topics that, you need to be a soil biologist, you need to be a computer programmer or an engineer to maybe understand how the Bitcoin network, how regenerative farming, carbon sequestration, we're just guys that are obsessed with this stuff and have dove down the research, but also pretty educated. If you're uneducated and not into these topics, how are you supposed to understand? And how the hell am I going to trust a journalist, no offense, that's good at writing stories to understand any of the technical aspects of these topics? And yeah, I mean, that's the whole goal of the book, right, is to present this information so there's key takeaways. But it's still, some average guy listening to Barstool Sports probably thinks this stuff's way over their head. So, we live in a bubble, but in reality, the majority of the population is so undereducated on these important aspects, and we're never taught about these things in our modern education system, which is really a shame. So yeah, that's what I would say is the biggest takeaway is that this stuff's complicated. So don't trust any information that's a headline, because it really is a nuanced field. So
yeah.
I know we're close on time, but
Yeah.
I mean, I could talk a little bit about Bitcoin energy consumption if you guys want. Or
Tristan, I'm curious, if you had to direct people in some direction in terms of learning more about some of these topics, where did you source most of your information from? What were some of the key data sets or firsthand books, stories that you used to come to some of these conclusions?
Yeah, so I mean, the Bitcoin piece, Bitcoin Twitter is definitely a Wild West place, and where I learned a lot of this information. You kind of have to sift through the weeds to see. I mean, from the energy consumption perspective, Nick Carter is a great resource. The Bitcoin Mining Council puts out fantastic data. Saifedean Ammous's Bitcoin Standard is kind of like the bread and butter of understanding why that matters. He also has a new book out called The Fiat Standard. I'm sure there's a couple other books that are fantastic. There's plenty of podcasts out there that talk about Bitcoin, and you can kind of piece by piece digest the information from a beef farming perspective. Sacred Cow, I think, is the gold standard, and probably some of my book is similar to that book in terms of the clearing up the criticisms, but I tried to paint new perspectives as well. And of course, comparing it and converging with Bitcoin decentralization is totally what my goal was. But Rob Wolf and Diana Rogers have done a fantastic job with that. So I always refer people to that book. And then if you want to dig more into the soil health, Joel Salatin, Gabe Brown's From Dirt to Soil, these are all fantastic reads. And then there's even more so in the terms of podcasts and YouTube videos. So that's kind of where I learned the foundational knowledge. I listen to most of those books. I just listen to most of my books nowadays. And then I kind of and that way I wasn't, just trying to, copy paste. I would never do that. I tried to really challenge myself. And, I listened to all these books. I got the foundational understanding, and then I went and found the research myself. So that's kind of how I did this book. And I'm sure there's definitely some overlapping studies, of course, but it really was eye-opening to go and find this information. And there's farms like White Oak Pastures we talked about that's putting out data on regenerative farming, carbon emissions as well. So yeah. And then of course to follow you guys, right?
Yeah,
100%.
The community that you can form online and just the amount of information, we've both learned so much just nutritionally about the Bitcoin space, like you talked about. There's so many great resources. The journalist piece is even interesting too, right? Where it's like, it's almost a double-edged sword, where then there's also these journalists like Nina Teicholz and Gary Taubes, et cetera, that have dove into properly understanding saturated fat and the role of fat versus carbohydrates, and have probably done more to push proper nutrition forward than 99.9% of Western doctors. So this stuff is it's just really interesting. It's an awesome space to be in. I think my last question for you is just, when you actually see a physical copy of this 200 pages, how much time and effort put into it, what is that feeling like for you now that it's released and you're promoting it and you're connecting with people on it?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost hard to believe still. Yeah, I mean, I worked, all of 2021 on it and got it out a couple months ago. So really was just my, any spare chance I got, I was working on this, and really I miss writing, to be honest. I feel like I'm less productive now because I'm just on social media trying to promote more often, and social media is such a a blessing and a curse, but obviously if we use it like we're using it, it's mostly positive. But yeah, it's really hard to believe, but at the end of the day, I would say it's people are it's the craziest thing ever, you wrote a book. And I was like, man, I did this, self-published on Amazon. I think people, if you're really passionate about something, you can get it done. I mean, there's nothing you can accomplish in today's society. You want to start a YouTube channel, you want to write a book, literally every tool is at your service. And I think I did the best job I could to put together a piece of content, and 200 pages, 300 plus citations, that's digestible, that is really pertinent to two main issues in our society. And something I'm really passionate about. So yeah, I'm really proud of what I accomplished. And to be honest, I think promoting the book is harder than writing it, because this is something that is just a task within itself. But coming on your guys' podcast is so enjoyable to talk about topics that we're both so passionate about, and educating more and more people. So we're also, trying to do our best to make the world a better place. And I think that's a really powerful way to wake up and live every day.
100%. And let us know what we can do, man. I mean, we love the ethos of what your book is all about, and that certainly strikes on with us. We're rooted in both communities as well, the carnivore animal based, and then also the Bitcoin community. So we are definitely fighting the good fight right alongside of you. So let us know what we can do to help, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'll see you guys in person at the Beef Initiative in next month, right?
Yeah,
So
coming up.
It's coming up.
Super stoked about that. And yeah, hopefully we'll continue to grow the community on social media. Anyone listening to this, I'll just share where you can find the book. It's live on Amazon, Bitcoin and Beef. It's the only book I'm aware of that it talks about both Bitcoin and beef in the same text. So definitely would appreciate anybody who picks up a copy. Please leave a 5-star review. Definitely helps with the Amazon algorithm. I know it works similar with the podcast here as well. So leave a 5-star review for the Meat Mafia podcast also. And on Twitter, I think I'm at Bitcoin and _beef, and then on Instagram, Bitcoin and Beef. I have 2 accounts, and then my main account on Instagram is Tristan _health, where I just post a lot of my daily habits and stuff. So check it out. And I think it'll really be a great resource to orange pill / beef pill your friends, or whatever you want to call it, and really just be a reference to like you said, why are these two paths converging, and some basic firepower for defending something that you may be passionate about having in your life.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks for coming on, and I'm sure we'll be in touch soon, man.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Tristan.